We're going to get started now. My name is Clara Hemphill. I'm the interim director of the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School, and I want to welcome you to our campaign roundtable. We're part of the Milano School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy, and if any of you would like to be students and learn how to work in government or be in nonprofit management, we do have admissions materials on the table outside. This is our second part of the panel on the New York State Senate. It's going to be in two parts. In one part, we'll sort of look at the horse race and how the Senate races were won. And then the second part, we're going to look at a little historical perspective to find out how Albany got to be the way it is and why it is so resistant to change. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff Smith.
Thank you very much, Clara, and thank you to the Center for New York City Affairs for sponsoring the panel. I also want to thank everyone who participated on the first panel. That was a fun, lively, candid discussion, and hopefully we'll be able to do as good of a job as the first panel did, although I'm surely not comparable to Robert George. So special thanks to Rob George for his humor and insight. I'm Jeff Smith, Assistant Professor of Politics and Advocacy at the Milano School. I'm joined by Bridget Bergen, who is with WNYC. She has kindly agreed to join me in moderating as an expert on the state Senate races. So now I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel. I think Bridget and I will take turns, so I'll start with Tom Doherty, who's immediately on our left. Tom is a partner of Mercury Strategies. He's a frequent guest on the popular weekly New York One current events show, Inside City Hall, with Errol Lewis. He also appears frequently on Al Jazeera America. Prior to joining Mercury, he was Governor Pataki's Deputy Secretary for Appointments. Thanks very much for being here, Tom.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I'm going to apologize to Jake and admit, because I'm in radio, we want to pronounce people's names correctly. So, Jake, I didn't get your last name, or pronounce Jake Delmani from the Parkside Group, and I don't have.
And actually, I'll go ahead and read
Thank
Jake's.
you.
Jake was a late addition to the panel. He was referred to me by a friend who told me that if you're going to have a panel on the state Senate, you've got to at least talk to him. And so I called him a few days ago, and after 10 minutes, I could see that my friend was right. He knew as much about the state Senate races as probably anybody in the state. And so I asked him if he would mind being on the panel. He said, "Are you sure? It's like 2 days away." And I told him, it's my panel. It's mine. I can appoint you. I can unappoint. Sorry, just kidding. Jake is vice president at the Parkside Group, a strategic consulting firm specializing in governmental affairs and campaign management. Acting as the firm's senior political consultant, he's elected several dozen individuals to legislative, executive, and judicial offices on local, state, and federal levels, including 1/3 of the current city council, half of the New York State Democratic Conference, numerous members of the state assembly, and some of New York's leading congressional Democrats. Thanks for joining us on short notice, Jake.
Thanks, Jake. Next to him, we have Gerald Benjamin. He was appointed as an Associate Vice President for Regional Engagement and Director of the Center for Research, Regional Education, and Outreach at SUNY New Paltz in 2008. That's the principal locus of the college's effort to raise its level of engagement within community governments, not-for-profits, and business across the Hudson Valley. He joined the New Paltz faculty as an assistant professor of political science in 1968, and in 2002 was appointed distinguished professor by the SUNY Board of Trustees. He's the director of the Center for New York State and Local Government Studies at SUNY's Rockefeller Institute of Government in Albany, or was, and has a long career in government and in political science, and is someone who we turn to often for his expertise, so we're glad he could join us here.
Next, we have Blair Horner. Blair is legislative director for the New York Public Interest Research Group. a nonpartisan research and advocacy organization. In over 30 years of work with New York PIRG, he's written and lobbied on a wide range of issues, including political reform, higher ed, consumer protection, environmental preservation, healthcare, and financial services. During 2007 and 2008, he was special advisor on policy and public integrity to Attorney General Cuomo. Thanks very much for being here, Blair.
We also have Nomi Konst, who is the founder and executive director of the Accountability Project, which is a nonprofit journalistic organization that investigates political corruption and the misconduct in New York. Not much to do there. At 28 years, the youngest woman ever elected to Congress in 2012 in her home district in southern Arizona. She was formerly a communications consultant for political candidates with a specialty working with women. She was also founder and former executive director of the Alliance Hollywood, an organization based in LA that trains members of the entertainment industry in how to speak effectively about politics. And she has a long list of credentials that I will not read all from the program. Thank you for being here.
Ben Lazarus, next, is political director of Students First in New York, where he directs all campaign activity from local school boards to the governor's race. Prior to that role, he was on President Obama's re-election campaign as a regional field director in the battleground state of Colorado. Great job there. They needed you out there in 2014. He was an aide to Manhattan Borough President Scott Stringer, has worked on a number of campaigns, and was a national senior fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, focused on predatory lending and credit access. He's a graduate of Yale, where he founded one of the original Students for Obama chapters. Thanks, Ben. Mm-hmm.
Then we have Janice Martin. He's an attorney, activist, and writer who recently served as special counsel to the Commission to Investigate Corruption, better known as the Moreland Commission. Prior to that, he was an associate at Siegel, Teitelbaum and Evans, and Hogan Lovells LLP. He's a born and raised New Yorker who attended Dartmouth and Fordham Law School. He's currently working to block the Comcast-Time Warner merger and preparing to launch a new political news site, Bright Lights, aimed at young professionals in New York.
Next up, David Neer. David's political director of Daily Kos, the largest online progressive community in the country, visited by over 6 million people a month. He's analyzed elections for the past decade as publisher of the acclaimed Daily Kos Elections Morning Digest newsletter, which I read while changing diapers every morning religiously. He's also responsible for Daily Kos's polling operations, race ratings, and candidate endorsements. He's a non-practicing lawyer who is also a Yaley, so a few of you on the panel. Thanks, David.
And we have Jeffrey Plout, who began his career in public affairs on the wrong side of a 19-2 vote in his 4th grade class. Hopefully you'll tell us more about that. Since then, however, he has racked up far more wins than losses in applying his political research and public affairs chops on behalf of elected officials, businesses, labor unions, and major nonprofits. I'll turn the page.
I'll
Jeff-
actually finish up Jeff's, because Jeff was my pollster when I ran for Congress a decade ago this cycle. And he was very prescient. I'll always respect his political judgment. He told me after taking a poll there was absolutely no way I could win the race. And I ended up losing by 1%, and his response was, "See, I told you."
There you go.
So, and we're still friends. And I didn't really do Bridget justice with that introduction, so let me say that she's a City Hall and politics reporter for WNYC. Her reporting has been featured on NPR, Marketplace, ABC Radio, the BBC, New York One. Previously, she was the station's general assignment reporter, and she has done stories, covered Occupy Wall Street, the 2012 elections, and the aftermath of the Newtown massacre. So we're delighted to have her here today, and Bridget, this panel is going to be sort of a 2-part panel, but we're kind of going to weave it together. We're going to talk about the state Senate races, and we're also going to kind of segue to talk about corruption more broadly, since it's an issue that's plagued the state legislature generally. So you want to kick it off, Bridget?
Sure, and I'm going to apologize if I appear slightly distracted. I have to keep one eye on my phone because as a working reporter, we are awaiting any news related to the decision in the Daniel Pantaleo case, related to the death of Eric Garner. So if
You want to hold your phone?
Yeah, if that news comes, I may end up moving on. But thank you very much. So, jumping into looking at some of the races and the results in those races, I think particularly looking at those 5 key Senate races where Republicans either ousted or took control. I'm curious from some of our consultants here who worked on those races, why were the Republicans so successful, or why did the Democrats do so poorly? Take it how you will.
There you go. I mean, I think if you look at the Senate races, I mean, and the ones that you would look at would be, Funky up in Rochester. You'd look at Sereno down in Dutchess, and certainly the Amador race. And then obviously there are others. You had to hold on to, Murphy had to hold on to the Ball seat. You had the Fischillo seat and the Zeldin seat that you had to hold on to, et cetera. I mean, I think the one thing this year that Republicans, first and foremost, you got to look at the fact that this was a very, very good Republican year nationally. And so you can't discredit that in any way, because the only race that was within single digits was the Sereno race in Dutchess County. And we didn't nominate bat-crazy candidates. That has historically been a problem for Republicans. And I am a Republican. And so, when you have a Funky up in Rochester who is a TV personality, who has no record, has not said anything, publicly that can come back, it helps you a lot. That said, after Grisante lost the primary in September, I mean, Republicans had to run a complete table. And the other thing I will say that they did this year, and we were part of it, we had a ground operation. We did not allow Democrats who historically, unions, et cetera, have knocked on more doors than us. We did digital this time. We knocked on tons and tons of doors, and we competed. And we competed in ways that we'll talk about later that people were tired of just getting 11 pieces of mail. So we did advertising on Pandora Radio. We did a lot of different things that I think paid off.
What did you understand about the electorates that you think the Democrats did not understand?
I don't think it was a question. I think that unlike a gubernatorial election, Senate races, assembly races are about the candidates. And if the candidates can get themselves out there and be and make the case individually without someone making the case against them, and the Republicans had the money to do that they could define themselves early on. Issues sometimes don't matter. Personalities matter, as you see. I mean, if you go back to a Libis, for instance, in Binghamton, he's under indictment.
Yeah.
The people of Binghamton, they knew Tom Libis, and that was the connection. So I think it doesn't come down to issues, it comes down to personalities in those races.
We want to take a moment and just introduce our additional panelist, Basil Smikle. He's a political and policy analyst with his self-named firm in its 11th year. He's featured on local and national media and contributes to thehill.com. He's a PhD candidate at Columbia University in education and politics and lectures at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, SIPA, and CUNY's Murphy Institute for Professional Studies. He holds a BS from Cornell University, the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and an MPA from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. Great to see you. Thank you.
Bridget, if I could comment, there are some structural points that have not been made. First of all, the districts were designed by Republicans. And when the Democrats actually captured a majority, it was unusual. Second, it was a perfect low turnout election for Republicans in New York. There may be a secular decline in the size of the electorate in New York, a secular decline against a low turnout, which suggests, if we think about consequences, suggests that reformers ought to start thinking about getting people to vote rather than figuring out new ways to register voters at the margin, where most voters are already registered. So that's something to discuss. Additionally, the kind of, I learned the word narrative this morning. I'm glad I showed up. I didn't know that word before, but the argument that there's this linear improvement in Republican circumstances. By the way, I was a Republican elected official for 12 years, so I'm not hostile. But the idea that there's a linear improvement is simply wrong. You can't find a linear improvement in a situation where half the Republicans who ran got less than a majority. Senate candidates got less than a majority of the voters who turned out if you count those who chose not to cast a ballot. In fact, the fundamental point is that we're engaged in coalition politics, and the Republicans had a perfect record for every person who won of putting the conservative independent lines in service of the Republican candidates. So the coalition that the post-election coalition that we got to pay attention to, the kind of European model where the coalition is formed after the election, distracted us from the fundamental fact that the coalition was very carefully constructed before the election. And then there was the national trend, and then there was the fortuitous circumstance of some self-destructing Democrat candidates. So I'm respectful of people who run campaigns, and they know a lot more than I do about that. But we have to pay attention to the way the election is structured and the structural conditions in this year and in New York politics to understand the outcome.
Just want to add one thing off Jerry's. When I was looking at the numbers for the number of voters, and what you see from 2010, the last gubernatorial election, to 2014, is a huge drop-off in the number of voters. Palladino and Astorino got roughly the same amount of fusion support in those two elections. Cuomo's dropped a huge amount. In 2010, Democratic Senate candidates actually did better in terms of the aggregate fusion number than Senate Republicans did. This time, there was a huge drop-off for both aggregate numbers, but much bigger for Senate Democrats. And when you look at the 4 key seats, or 5, it's roughly 30,000 vote difference. If the Democrats had come out, that might have made a big difference. And so the story of the 2014 election, I think, is the story of the vanishing voter. Historic low turnout in New York State, particularly among Democrats, and that had a big impact on who won in the state Senate.
I think one thing to add, though, that I heard in the first panel a lot, too, is this idea that it was sort of inevitable. It was a big Republican year. Of course, the Republicans were going to win. There, by my count, I think 7 really competitive races in the state, and Republicans needed to win 5 out of 7 to take just a 1-seat majority. And of those 7, 3 were Democratic incumbents, a lot of whom were popular. At one point in our polling, Terry Gibson was up 20 points.
So talk a little bit about that race.
So, that race tightened throughout, and we always thought it would. I think, to Tom's point, it was a question of candidates and their popularity on the ground, and the more people knew Sue Serino, the more they liked her and the more her numbers moved. But something happened beyond just, well, it was a Republican year and the demographics favored Republicans. This wasn't just a win.
Give a little more context, if you don't mind, for some of the people in the audience who aren't as familiar with the granular terrain as well as you are.
Sure. By our count, when we started looking at this in spring at Students First, there were 8 really competitive races that would determine the majority. One fell by the wayside in Long Island with the Fushilla seat, where the Democratic candidate turned out to be a criminal. And had to withdraw from the race. So at that point, there were 7. So you had 2 on Long Island, 1 in Rochester, 1 in Buffalo, and 3 in the Hudson Valley. That's 7, right? And Republicans had to win 5 out of those 7. And you had 3 incumbents in the Hudson Valley. 1 in Rochester, 2 in the Hudson Valley, in districts 41, 46 in the Hudson Valley, and 55 in Rochester. So Republicans did win 6 out of 7 and did take a clear majority, but it wasn't just a structurally Republican year. It was also, there was a tiny, tiny margin of error, and they basically ran the table.
Jake.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, not to beat a dead horse here, but I don't want to say it was all because there was a very low turnout across the state. But you did have about 30% turnout, historically low, and Democrats in particular weren't showing up. And we have sophisticated modeling that we, try and predict how many voters are going to come out, what the likely voters are going to be, who they're going to be, and all that. And anywhere from 7 to 15%, our estimates were lower than we thought. And these are of likely voters, not registered voters. These are people that typically vote in midterm elections, vote in down ballot races. And even the people that normally do that didn't show up this year. And those are mostly Democrats. And
So what do you attribute that to?
a lack of enthusiasm for certain other Democrats. So, a lot of people don't.
Come on,
particularly
this is the
turn out.
post-election panel. We're not letting you get away with that.
You
a,
signed
la-
the waiver.
a lack of enthusiasm for perhaps voting for the governor. People aren't thrilled with the president. And that's, a combination of people on the right and the left. I mean, I know the first panel talked at length about Zephyr Teachout and how, the left, the left is not happy with the governor. And that was a problem, and we saw some of that stuff in the polling we did and some of the research we did. But if you look at the three, forget about Long Island for a second, where that was an incumbent Republican who our Democratic candidate lost to. You look at the three upstate seats that we lost that were held by incumbent Democrats, Terry Gibson in Putnam and Dutchess County, Ted O'Brien in Rochester, and C.C. Katchik in a district that's basically Ulster to Albany. It's a big district that was created for George Amador, who lost in 2012. It was a better year, obviously. C.C. still only won by like 18 votes. We were in recount until January. She wasn't seated in the chamber until after our session started. But these were districts that people argued at the time we should never won. Maybe we shouldn't have won them, but we ran good campaigns. They were well-funded campaigns. This time we were funded. You can always be better funded. If we had more money, I don't know the outcome would have changed. If you lose by 12 points, spend another $1 million, I don't know what's going to change. The point being, these are likely Republican districts. When you look at not just total voters, because you look at total registration, you always see more Democrats than Republicans. That means nothing, because those people don't vote. It's the likely voters. And most of these districts they lean likely Republican, or they lean Republican in terms of likely voters. And these are tough districts. And then when you take that and you lay it on top of the fact that Democrats are not coming out, that's a recipe for disaster. And when you lose by 12 points in a district that you won 2 years ago, to me, that's, we poll tested our messages. We had field operations. We did everything that a well-run campaign does, and to then lose by 12 points, that's a turnout issue. So respectfully, I think it is turnout.
Jeff Plow, you did some polling for Senate Democrats in the state. Can you talk a little bit about that and then respond to Jake?
Well, sure. We saw this as a bad cycle very early on. I wasn't working for the committee, but I did poll in some of these races. And I think one of the things, you reap what you sow in politics, and the redistricting processes in 2010 made a difference, and it made a difference in other states around the country. Currently, there's only 7 states where you have a Democratic governor and Democratic control of the legislature. There's 24 states where you have Republican governors and Republican control of the legislature. So there's a broader trend. Obama's numbers is 39% approval rate in the state. That's important. It does frame, there is a national component of these.
In New York, he was only at 39?
Yeah.
That's really fascinating, isn't it? That in the second bluest state in the country, his numbers were, just a tick below his national numbers?
Yeah.
So what do you attribute that?
I think he's taken on a lot of water, and the president, around healthcare, around Ebola, around Americans being beheaded in front of the country, and there's a lot of frustration that tends to flow to the executive. I don't agree with the sentiment that Cuomo wasn't strong enough, therefore we lost races underneath it. Of the Northeast governors, I have Dan Malloy in Connecticut. He won by 2 points. Cuomo won. Generally in politics, when Rudy Giuliani won by big margins in the city, he never brought along a Republican city council with him. It's not the way politics works and stuff, and so it's a carry your own water game. So the Republicans won these races. I do think that the focus after the national losses in 2012, I have a United States Senator, Donnelly from Indiana, and we ran against a nut job, who was trying to describe the difference between a rape and a pregnancy, and that was several Republican candidates. I think the Republican Party, which historically has elected adults and nominated adults and kind of took a departure, I think is back on course with nominating candidates. And I also think that the Republican coalition Senate and the Democratic governor did the SAFE Act, did marriage equality, lowered taxes, have improved the credit rating, and from a nonpartisan point of view, that's not too shabby.
Jeff, I want to jump in. expound on Gerald's structural point, because I think it's really important. I think until we sort of settle these structural questions, the rest of the conversation is kind of moot. The question is, who actually wants a Democratic state Senate? And we heard in the previous panel about, the counterpoint for whether Governor Cuomo really does. I was unmoved by what the Cuomo panelists had to say. I think it's pretty clear he's at the least satisfied, if not happier, with a Republican-controlled state Senate. I'm pretty sure Sheldon Silver is absolutely fine with a Republican-controlled state Senate. And my only addendum to what Gerald said is the Republicans did draw the lines, but it was in a deal to let Assembly Democrats draw their lines, and they increased their seats. They now control 106 out of 150 Assembly seats. So I've seen no effort in the last, decade that I've been watching this closely that Sheldon Silver has any interest in a Democratic state Senate. And I'm not sure if all of the Democratic state senators want a majority. I mean, a lot of them were elected into this permanent minority status, and they're kind of okay with that. And we can talk about that more during the culture of corruption portion of this. But, I just don't see a lot of firepower behind electing a majority of state Democrats, Senate Democrats. And I know that there are certain senators, from New York City who certainly feel that way.
I think we've got some interesting dynamics here. We've talked about some of the structural issues that exist, and yet also this idea that these races are very local and they're run based on the individual candidates themselves. We had three elected officials up for re-election who are indicted. 2 won, 1 lost. How does that happen? How do you understand, how these issues play out locally, and how, the local electorate responds to these issues facing these candidates?
So, I think the bigger issue here about Democrats is that they're facing an existential crisis. I mean, we can get into the nitty-gritty about, who turned out and how the districts were drawn, but the essence of it is that right now, the way that Democrats are running elections nationally, locally, across the country, is they're relying on an old mechanical form of running campaigns. And you're talking about the polling, and you're polling the messaging, and it was working, and then why didn't the results turn in? I really feel like you have to communicate to voters in a different way, because in New York State, the base voters are older, and they do lean more Republican. And if you're not getting the other majority of the electorate that's likely to turn out, how are you going to speak to them? And these are the questions that I hear from voters. And in this room and at this table, it might seem too far-reaching, but there has to be another answer. I mean, you can't rely on canvassing to turn out younger people, to turn out likely younger people. I mean, you worked on the Obama election. You know very well that there are other ways to communicate, and it can't just be Pandora. I mean, that was a very clever way of reaching out to voters, but there's got to be something a little bit broader. Because when you look at someone who's been indicted, that the fact that 2 of the indicted individuals were run by the machine, they were relying on a base that turns out for them in districts where the machine still operates. But what about these districts where the machine doesn't operate very well, where the candidates that are running, it's possibly some of these districts are a little bit more gentrified. I mean, how are you communicating to those voters?
I've actually, I actually talk about that a lot, because I always felt that the president, in his brilliance of going outside of the party organizations, did what he had to do to get elected. But unfortunately, when you do that, you don't enhance the party structures in states. You tend to sort of ossify the political pathways where people normally will try to get recruited to run for office, or you have multiple folks running for office, and you actually get the machine engaged. He didn't do that, and I don't fault him for that, because he did what he had to do to win. But the problem is, as I said, it changes the dynamic within state party organizations. And I think you're absolutely right that without sort of that centralized structure, and I can go back and forth whether or not I really do support political machines, but if there are folks that come out to vote based on that, and they know that they are to do that, Democrats down ballot, when the president's not running, have to be a lot better at engaging those diehard voters. Most of them are older.
Well, a fundamental point is you can't beat somebody with nobody. Mm-hmm. The Republicans had no candidate in 16 Senate races. No candidate, not counting the throwaway candidacies. And Sampson's race, there was the Working Family Party and the Conservative Party actually were the loyal opposition. They had candidates. So,
So how do you
first thing
think-
the
why do you think
Republicans have to
Sampson-
do to build a party is have a candidate, not rocket science. You know, you can't get votes if you don't have a candidate on the line. Even if you have to promise the guy or the woman who runs a job in the Senate staff if they lose. You know, that would be a productive and positive use of patronage, to assure that you had a candidate in Queens, in every Senate district in Queens, in every Senate district in Brooklyn and Manhattan. I would assure a person a step in their career so that you'd have those candidacies. Second point, and let me, I looked at the numbers for this. We're not talking about apples and apples when we look at elections where there are 20,000 voters and elections where there are 80,000 voters. You know, down here in my former place of birth, New York City, I transformed into an apple knocker some years ago, but the range of votes for the Senate was 55,000 in the Kruger election and 20,000 in the Rivera election. That was the range of number of voters, not counting the ones who didn't cast a ballot. On Long Island, the range was 79,000 Lavelle election and 58,000 the least turnout election, the Croce election. So the lowest participation election for the Senate on Long Island was higher than the higher participation election, the highest in New York City. So something's going on. You know, there's some different political, when we talk about turnout, by the way, we're talking about a very different world down here in the city than in Monroe County. I mean, it's just, so we're trying to understand the phenomenon that can't be explained. All the elements are not in one category. There are multiple categories, and we have to disaggregate to understand. So there's more to say about that. I don't want to just keep throwing numbers out, but.
Just to sort of follow up and then tie into the corruption thing. I mean, these numbers, basically, if 30% of the eligible voters turn out in the election, that means 16% roughly voted for the governor, right? So it's a very small percentage of the public that shows up for anything. Jerry's numbers are also telling. I mean, so why? Right? Part of it is, as Jerry mentioned earlier, the redistricting. The way that the lines are drawn is only 29. We counted 29 out of 213 legislative seats, where they're within 1% of the average. They generally are clustered one way or the other. Very pro-Republican, so the voters think, well, why should I even show up, right? In New York City in particular, it's a one-party place. On top of it, if they think that Albany is just filled with knaves and crooks, why would they show up and vote in those elections either? And I think where there's this national trend that was talked about in the first panel, and I pointed out in my first comment, I think the governor came in saying he was going to do something different. I think Moreland really hurt him, and I think further suppressed the Democratic vote in New York that you may not have seen otherwise. And given that 4 of the Senate seats, 4 of the battleground Senate seats, turned on 30,000 votes in the aggregate, and the turnout for the Senate Democrats from 2010 to 2014 in the aggregate was somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000 or 500,000 infusion. If you had just pulled some more of those votes out, you might have turned some of those seats. And so, again, I don't care who gets elected to the state Senate. I mean, we're nonpartisan. That's not my deal. But when you look at a historic low turnout, it's part national, it's part what's going on in the state. The voters are increasingly getting turned off by what's going on in Albany, so they don't vote. And that means heavier and heavier reliance on special interest groups to get elected, and that's a democracy death spiral. And that is what we've been seeing over the last 30 years.
Ben, I think he just accused you of facilitating democracy's death spiral. Would you care to respond?
It's a lot of credit. Look, I think that this is how good.
And Ben, why don't you describe, just give the audience a little bit of context about how much money Students First spent and your participation in the races this cycle?
Sure. Students First New York, we established a PAC, New Yorkers for a Balanced Albany. We raised and spent about $4.2 million across the state.
This is feeling more like Albany all the time.
We went into this race. We are also nonpartisan. We care about only one thing, which is the education policy agenda we support. We support lots of Democrats at every level who support that agenda. We've supported Republicans who support that agenda. Going into this race, this election cycle, the only open question was who was going to control the state Senate. Would it be Democrats or Republicans? For us, for the policies that we want to see passed, it was clear that a governing environment that we've had with Republicans in control of the Senate was going to be better for our issues. So that's what we pursued. I mean, that's why we exist, right? Is to pursue and give political help to our agenda. And I will say on the idea of, well, people are so dissatisfied, and I definitely give some credence to that, especially in the turnout numbers, but there is another side of it, which is that, the governor won by a huge margin, saying he made Albany work for the first time, 4 on-time budgets and the SAFE Act and, all sorts of things that he was able to accomplish, property tax cap. And to at least some people, and I especially think some people on Long Island, given the polling, they looked at the governor and the state Senate and said, this is working. Things are going well. And so we want to reelect the governor and we want to keep our Republican state Senate because this is working. And for us, for our education issues, that was the same case. So that's why we certainly support the governor and we support the Republican state Senate because it was working for the things we care about.
So can I comment on students first? And I'm going to preface this by saying I like Ben. I saw this tactic used effectively last panel. I like Ben. I think he's done great work. Students first, I was very surprised from a policy and political aspect that they chose to spend so much money for the Republican side. On the policy, I mean, if you're supporting students first, a Democratic Senate would presumably deliver more in the way of anti-poverty measures, affordable housing, and all kinds of other things that help kind of students who go to charter schools than a Republican Senate would. But just on a political level, it's just really throwing in their hat with a Republican Senate as opposed to the kind of bipartisan education reform that we've seen in the past. So I was a little curious about that. But pivoting that to a question I have for Jake is, what was the message in, I saw these Students First ads, I looked at them the last few days, and they're like, if you elect these senators, Bill de Blasio is going to come over and tax you, and New York City is going to control your life, and I mean, they're really kind of appalling ads, but they must have worked, and I wonder, what was the narrative that Senate Democrats were supposed to be using in, Westchester, upstate, Rochester, to counter this notion that a Senate Democrat takeover would mean a New York City-focused agenda?
So let me just start with saying that I don't know how much I believe in even voters who vote in midterm elections, I don't know that they think about who they want, what party they want to control the state Senate. And I think that's like kind of a nebulous thing to them. What does that mean? I don't think they know that. I'm talking about people who vote on a regular basis. With that aside, though, as we've said a few times, the Senate races, obviously these are local elections, so it's very individualized across the state. We saw in some places the attack that if you vote for the Democrat, Bill de Blasio is going to come and take your house and kidnap your kids or whatever. That worked some places. Other places it didn't really work. I mean, it was always a little bit effective. It was a matter of how effective. But what we saw, and we did polling, we did research, we had all the data in front of us to make the best decisions we could given our resources. So the messages we pushed differed depending where we were. So, somewhere like Westchester, where they care immensely about property taxes, that was something we pushed. Now, we can get into a whole long conversation about how to inoculate yourself against the opponent so when they hit you back, it doesn't matter as much, and then you go whatever. But that would be a whole other panel. But the point being, we ran these candidates on messages that historically had worked, and that I'm not going to say didn't work this time. Again, I don't think it was completely a message problem the Democrats had. I mean, everyone's message could always be better. Candidates could always do better. The direct mail could always be better. The TV, whatever. But we were pushing messages that the candidates believed in, the conference believed in, that were effective and were specific to where we're running. So if it's property taxes in Westchester, or if it's more state funding for schools in Greene County, whatever it is, we were pushing these messages that we thought, and I still think they are, effective for the specific electorate they were targeted to.
Basil?
If I can just go go off of your point related to students first. So for full disclosure, in 2010, I was a Senate candidate against incumbent Bill Perkins in Harlem, Upper Manhattan. Charter schools and school choice was a big part of my platform. I don't think you guys were around and supportive yet at that point. You didn't exist at that point. So, but to sort of to respond to your point, there are Democrats that actually care about this issue. It's not just Republicans. But so I would also add, if I remember correctly, there was an article that came out in the Wall Street Journal after the race that New York State United Teachers went to court to change the law so they could spend more money against me than was legally permissible at that time. So my point is that if you're concerned about special issues on one side, there are folks on the other side doing very similar things. And to go to Thomas's earlier point. Okay, I can call you Tommy, thanks. To go to Tommy's earlier point, it really matters what's happening on the ground. And I think in my race in that year, it probably wasn't going to take hold as much because the issue of school choice was nationalized perhaps too much. But if you talk to parents then and you talk to parents now, it really is about what they care about, and if candidates really focus on that, then that's how they become successful. There are other structural problems as well, where I was going up against an entrenched incumbent and needed probably about $750,000 to actually be successful against him, and that's another structural issue. But I think in terms of actually engaging voters where they are and vote and encouraging candidates to speak directly to them and talk about things they care about, that's what you're seeing.
In terms of the, Willie Sutton once said, when asked why he robbed banks, because he said that's where the money is. When it comes to campaign contributions, the money comes from Wall Street and real estate developers in Manhattan. And they came in big again, and to set up these, part of our discussion is on the Senate, I think rent control is going to be a ferocious fight because Wall Street real estate folks were in big. A lot of these were donors to both the governor and the Senate Republicans. I think many of the hedge fund folks that are involved in the charter school fight are going to make sure that that issue gets put. By the way, NYPIRG has no position on either one. I have no particular axe to grind. But as more and more money gets spent on elections, and it comes from a smaller percentage of the population. We did an analysis in 2013 that showed that 35,000 New Yorkers were reported in the state's campaign finance database as having made a donation. That's 0.2% of the population. That's 99% of the public really doesn't participate in a meaningful level in the campaign finance system. That system's going to get worse. And so I think that suppresses voter participation. And I think it raises issues on Albany's legislative agenda that may have been dealt differently in a different context.
Let me just, forgive me, the real opportunity for reformers is in primaries against corruption, not in general elections. If you get into the general election in a one-party environment, you shouldn't be surprised with the outcome. Now, but in a primary, and it's kind of counterintuitive, because a small electorate advantages incumbents. But if the election gets small enough, the incumbent is vulnerable. So when we complain about people under indictment getting elected, the point to get, and of course, we move the primary day around in New York, so it's another complication. But the time to be mobilized is for the nomination, not for the general election.
Gerald, you raised the issue of primaries. And I'd like to back up a little bit and talk about the primaries, and I'd like to bring David in, because one of the interesting phenomena that we watched this cycle was the candidates who primaried the IDC incumbents. And I know Daily Kos got active in a couple of those races. Can you talk about that decision and what impact you think it might have had, talk both about the primary and then talk about the general election? I.e., we talked about de Blasio's or Cuomo, we talked about Obama, like what demobilized Democrats. Do you think the IDC victories in any way demobilize Democrats in the fall?
Sure. So Daily Kos endorsed two candidates who challenged IDC members in the primaries, Oliver Capel against Jeff Klein, the leader of the IDC, and John Liu against Tony Avella, one of the IDC members. And we started out with, I don't want to say high hopes. We knew that both races, particularly the Klein race, were going to be difficult. But at the time, it had appeared that the mainstream Democrats were really ready to support Capel and to really heavily fund his campaign, and that unions would come in big, and that he would at least have a fighting chance. And what happened was the IDC completely outfoxed mainstream Democrats, and they put forward this claim that, oh, they were going to come home, they were going to return to the fold, and they had made some sort of deal to return to the mainstream Democratic conference. And that really took the wind out of the sails for these progressive challengers to the IDC, particularly when you had Bill de Blasio coming in and saying, well, yeah, I'm endorsing Jeff Klein. And of course, as it turned out, we warned at the time this deal was bogus, and now Jeff Klein has made it clear in public statements that he really would rather stay in partnership with the Republicans. And so we were kind of left out there on our own, that the cavalry never really arrived. And both of these challengers fell short, though John Liu came fairly close. What I don't think that those wins, that any regular voters really cared about them in terms of the general election. But what I think happened related to that is I think that Andrew Cuomo pulled off an absolutely brilliant move in securing the Working Families Party line, because all of a sudden in the fall, you had the WFP, they were forced to make sure that they got their enough voters to get 50,000 votes on their ballot line for a guy that most of their supporters and most of their members really didn't like, in Andrew Cuomo. Otherwise, they would have lost their ballot line for the next 4 years. And so instead of focusing on these state Senate races, they instead had to focus to help get a guy elected who I think most of their members didn't particularly care for. So I think that was really how things played out in the general election in that regard.
I thought the fact that the Republicans ended up with a straight numerical advantage in the state Senate actually made it easier for Klein, because I think the theory was at the time that if the Democrats had a numerical advantage, they would come home. And since they don't, and if Simca Feldis, in a sense, gives them the 33rd, there's now that I think gives a lot more flexibility to Klein to negotiate a deal similar to what he did in 2011. I mean, in 2010, the Republicans, the last time there was a gubernatorial, they took the Senate, and they had a coalition with Klein. The wild card, of course, in their minds must be, like 2012 wasn't a good year for the Senate Republicans, what are they going to be facing in 2016 when 20% higher turnout rate shows up at the polls? That could have a different dynamic for the Senate Republicans and may strengthen Klein's hand in terms of his negotiations with the Senate Republicans.
Blair, you started to tease this out a little bit, but in terms of some of the major policy fights that we're now going to see because of the Republican control of the Senate, rent control, can you talk a little bit more about where you see those other battles happening, and what did Cuomo gain by, to some degree staying out of the fight, despite what his folks here said in the last panel that, supporting Senate Democrats was very much part of their campaign?
Well, I'm not a Democratic strategist, so I don't know if he did as much as he said he would do or not enough. I know what the reports are. I think next year's legislative session is going to be very difficult for a lot of the things that the governor said he supported and that the Senate Democrats argued for. I think the DREAM Act is going to be very hard to get done. I think certainly public financing of elections is going to be difficult to get done. I think the women's agenda is difficult to get done. Rent control has to get dealt with. Charters has to be dealt with in the context of the budget, so it's going to play out. I think what the governor chooses to do with the budget is what's going to drive the legislative agenda this year. If he embraces his proposals and puts them in the budget, I think it's very difficult. New York has, I don't know if it's unique, but it's certainly rare if it's not unique, power vested in the governor to drive policy initiatives in the budget process. And if the governor chooses to do that, I don't think he can run the table on all of his issues because he wants an on-time budget more than anything. I think that he might be able to achieve some of the initiatives that might not be as central to Republican opposition. So there's a number of issues. The property tax cap is another issue that comes up this year. They're talking about a special session in the next few weeks, which some of these issues may come off the table if there is one, and if it's part of a pay raise deal or something like that. So, the dust hasn't completely settled, but I think what the governor chooses to do with his budget will be the main driver in whatever policy changes actually occur in Albany next session.
If I can add, is not mayoral control up next year as well?
Mayoral control is up, so that's going to have to be renegotiated. And I would also say on the list of things that have to get done, I mean, there's also, 143,000 kids trapped in failing schools in New York City. To us, that's a crisis that needs to be dealt with as soon as possible as well.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see I expect the mayor will want to retain mayoral control. I don't think he's going to give it up. But it'd be interesting to see what negotiations he has with the Republican Senate in that regard, especially with Teach-Out, especially with Teach-Out saying now that she's going to challenge the governor on charters.
Bridget, let's think about one of these issues for a minute and segue into the history you want to talk about just briefly. Classically, there have been sufficient number of Republican senators to block the Republicans having an effective majority in the Senate, even when the Republicans have a majority. So classically and historically, there have been between 4 and 6 Republican senators from New York City. But take the issue of rent control. If you look at the history of it, the issue of rent control, that's a live or die issue for legislators in New York City. And so, notwithstanding the power of money, the power of vote says if you're going to people think you're going to take their home away, they're not going to be able to afford living where they're living. They're going to be unhappy about your performance. Now, we have a situation where there are 32, perhaps 33, counting Felder, Republican votes. 2 of those are from New York City. So we have the same situation we've had historically regarding rent control, that breakaway Republicans from New York City can block action until they get what they want. And it's proved that they'll do it historically, not these individuals, but historically. So the dynamic of the Republican majority has been insufficiently attended to. Because of it, now there's one other point, and I won't talk about it in detail now because I wanted to take the illustration of an example of an issue that Blair raised that's going to be compelling, where we think the big money is going to run things, but may indeed not run things because of an internal dynamic and re-election concerns in Brooklyn and on Staten Island. So the next point is, if you look at coalition theory and you have the marginal vote can block you from acting, that vote has enormous power. So that's what drives the potential of dealing with the IDC. That you diminish the 2 things that happen are you diminish the power of the marginal vote, and you bring more upstate votes into the coalition, diminishing the internal power of the New York City Republicans to block action.
Well, look, if I was the Republican leader, which I'm not, and I looked and I said, we did marriage equality, and each of my guys that went for it lost an election, and I'm a progressive and I care about marriage equality, then maybe having Jeff Klein and some other Democrats around who let me put some of my guys off the hook on tougher votes, which kind of progressives care about, is a good thing. And so we shouldn't so quickly dismiss the idea that we did the SAFE Act, that we did marriage equality, that we kind of have a government that works, and that we have Republicans who are worrying about general elections, at least to some significant degree, rather than the way it is around most parts of the country, where Republicans don't care about general elections at all, really. They're all worried about primaries, which reflects why many members of the United States Congress are talking about another government shutdown.
So a couple of you have mentioned de Blasio in the context of mayoral control of schools, also in the context of the TV ads that, what did you say, argued, what were your words, Jake? They said that the mayor would come in and kidnap your kids?
You kidnap your kids, yeah.
I think they probably said the mayor's going to come in and make your son grow an afro.
Right.
Is that it? No.
Right. He'll make you a Sandinista.
Make you a Sandinista, yeah. So he's clearly a bogeyman in a lot of these upstate campaigns. How do you think that, 2-part question, how do you think that affects his ability to negotiate in Albany, especially with the Republican Senate? And secondly, what about the piece he just wrote in the Huffington Post, encouraging Democrats nationally to stiffen their spines, have backbone? How do you think that plays up in the state capitol?
Well, I'll take the second part of that question. So, this has been a debate since Election Day of, should Democrats have, gone farther, more progressive, and really, push whatever you want them to push, whatever the policy is, or should they have adhered to a more moderate tone because the electorate was much more moderate? I can't speak for what happened around the country. My belief is that given the makeup of the electorate this year, and it's not like the candidates didn't talk about progressive issues. All the candidates in these competitive races talked about more funding from the state for local school districts. They talked about raising the minimum wage, talked about the Women's Equality Act, all these things that you would identify as liberal items. So they talked about them. I don't know what going more gung-ho there would have looked like, and I don't think it would have helped. In any midterm year, the electorate it's older, it's whiter, it's wealthier. When you have a midterm year where you have very low turnout on the Democratic side, it's even more white, more old, and more wealthy. I don't know that talking about income inequality would have resulted in a better outcome for Democrats. That said, I know the other side of the argument is, well, maybe it would have brought some folks out to vote. Maybe. I think there were bigger things here that kept them at home. So I don't know that having gone out there and said whatever the more radical version of what we said would have been, I don't know if that would have helped.
Mr. Smith, you're talking about several hundred years of history of an upstate-downstate conflict in New York. Making the mayor the object of enmity in upstate New York is as New York as apple pie. That's literally the way politics has proceeded. The difference in contemporary politics from historic politics in New York is that this dichotomous analysis is not as helpful. As the Democrats have moved up, people who identify as Democrats have moved up the Hudson Valley and into the North Country and so on. We see a left challenge to a governor winning in primaries in upstate counties, in rural upstate counties. So you're talking about a classic pattern that worked in a constrained environment, but that was just described, but that is questionable in a bigger electorate.
Let me just add one thing on your point about the mayor. I think the mayor's going to have a hard time in Albany, right? He's viewed as a partisan liberal Democrat. The Senate is controlled by moderate to conservative Republicans. The last mayor was phenomenally successful, and he was the single biggest campaign contributor to the Senate Republican Campaign Committee. Now, there's a surprise, right? The single biggest campaign contributor to the Senate Republican Campaign Committee is reasonably successful in what he wants. Now, he can get everything. So de Blasio is going to have a much harder time because he's not in that category. I don't know how it's going to play out for him in terms of the issues that he has to deal with. Some of these issues like rent control, charter schools, mayoral control, these other issues are structural, institutional issues that will have to be addressed one way or the other. But I think the mayor is going to have a harder time persuading Senate Republicans who basically ran against him.
Well, he also, we don't talk about that he went out and raised money against them. He was very active in this campaign, not just he's a liberal Democrat. There was more reason to say, he opposed me. And, the point going back in time is historically the bogeyman's a good thing for you if you're a politician, to have someone to go after. And George Pataki, my former boss, had Sheldon Silver. I learned a valuable lesson. I was really young up there, and, Mike Bragman was taking on Shelley Silver, and I thought this is going to be a great thing. Shelley, we don't like Shelley. Shelley's gone. And the inside guys are like, no, we want Shelley Silver. He's the liberal New York City guy we love rallying around for our upstate voters. And I was like, yeah, that's smart. And so You know, I love all the theories, and I'm a little surprised as I sit around a table of Democrats that you guys are like so down about all of a sudden you don't know how to win elections, et cetera, and our turnout's so weak, et cetera.
Jerry and I are not Democrats.
Yeah, well, Jerry, you know, I mean, okay. I have a different perception of the world. I guarantee after we sit around
Thinks I'm a closet Democrat.
after we sit around after November 2016, the conversation every 2 years, the question going forward now is whether or not my party is an off-year party. Can we win a national election? You know, Jeff raised a point earlier about, you know, we didn't nominate locally or nationally candidates that talked about rape and abortion, et cetera, et cetera. You know, do we continue that trend and nominate reasonable people in 2016? That will tell us a lot. But this idea, so much is driven by the national agenda. What is going on nationally? If you had a very, very popular president, that would trickle down to New York. There's no question about that. It's always been the case, but for local Senate, for local assembly races, I've always believed that the guy knocking on your door at the end of the day is the guy you go vote for. And so, can you change the numbers a little bit? The idea that party machines, you know, we used to say, oh, the Nassau Republican machine, they're not driving anybody out. That's BS. You know, that's certainly no longer the case. People are motivated by their own selfish interest, and if they were so angry with New York, if they were so angry with the government, they would come running out. And I think Ben made a very good point, is that people, I think, particularly like in Long Island, et cetera, were very comfortable with the fact that the governor, in his way, worked with the Senate Republicans. They seemed to, you know, sort of have things under control there, et cetera. And people are going to vote their own selfish interest, and that, and we can do different things, but this idea that all of a sudden Democrats don't know how to run, you know, grassroots stuff, et cetera, is, I just think, preposterous. I hope you think that, but it's just not. It's not.
Well, you know, let me say, I'm an upstater. You know, I don't know how many upstaters are here. I'm also a political scientist.
Upstate, what do you consider upstate? I'm always interested.
I live in
I
live in New Paltz.
Well, that's upstate, but is Westchester upstate in your eyes?
No.
No, I didn't.
Okay, so wherever you live, upstate is further north.
What about Buffalo?
Okay, when I was trained as a political scientist, we had something called party accountability. You know, the whole government should be controlled by one party, and then we should hold them accountable. And I've lived in New Paltz for 45 years. At some point, I decided that I wanted a Republican Senate because that was the way to hold the government accountable. Putting aside my partisanship, divided partisan control seemed to me to be desirable, not undesirable. And I think a lot of thoughtful people, not just partisans, but a lot of thoughtful people are concerned, you know, concerned about becoming Massachusetts, although they just elected a Republican governor, which brings to the next point. How come the Republican Party spokesman in the previous panel said that the city was a hopeless challenge when it had Republican Republican mayors for 20 years? Why aren't the elections being translated into party building? Well, not in the interest of the people who are winning, maybe, because they want to focus on their own careers, not the institutional infrastructure.
But you know, in New York City, let's be fair, that you need a perfect storm, and you also, I think, are getting very close. You need a perfect storm to elect a Republican statewide in New York. The perfect storm could very well be in New York if Mayor de Blasio moves so far to the left. If, for instance, if crime got out of control, et cetera, you could see a wealthy Republican come back and win an election in New York. Outside of that, and you always saw that with Giuliani, because people said it's desperate, we can't do it. And then Bloomberg, with hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, did not win massive landslides. I mean, New York is a tough place to, and I disagree with an earlier comment that as much as I love party building, and I think it's really important, Nick DiOrio called me earlier last year and said he was running for Congress in Manhattan. And I said, why? Because he believes in stuff. I said, look, you're going to get 18% of the vote. You're getting 18. Oh, you're wrong. I'm going to go, okay. He got 19.
You were wrong.
Right, and I told him, and apologized to him. I said, if I sent you $1,000, you would have got 19 by one. My point is that when you have limited resources and you know you got to run a table in other areas, spending any money in Brooklyn for a Senate race, any money in the Bronx, for instance, where it's hopeless, you'd like to think you could have competition in those areas, but there are limited resources to do it statewide.
I don't want to go on, take too much time, but that's an enormously powerful argument for public campaign finance, because it frees the resources of the party to do what it's supposed to do.
I'd rather have term limits.
But so that's something for another day. Let me just a math lesson. There are 25 Senate seats in New York City. There are 2 Republicans, so that's 23 seats. 23 from 60 is 40. There are 2 Democrat seats upstate that were conceded by the Republicans. There was no candidate. So by my calculation, the Republicans needed to win 30 of 38 seats outside New York City to get their majority. That is 78.9%. I think that's an extraordinary political achievement. Just take note of those numbers.
So
Just to add in terms of achievements, I mean, you can't ignore what the governor did. I mean, this goes back to your point about asking about de Blasio. I mean, the Republicans took the governor's race in Massachusetts and Maryland, right, blue states. The governor in Connecticut won in a squeaker. Cuomo won handily, despite what I thought actually was a pretty good campaign run by his opponent, who is probably well positioned for 4 years from now. But so I think sometimes I think Democrats, I heard it on the first panel, was sort of piling on the governor. He actually ran a pretty good race. He left, there was no oxygen in the room for the Republicans to move to the center, frankly, because he ran as a centrist. His whole strategy for 4 years looked like it was to be firmly in the middle so there'd be no place for a Republican opponent to go. I think they underestimated.
But did he win in moderate districts? I mean, when you really look at the map, like he won in Buffalo, not Erie County. He won in the Hudson Valley, no surprise, and he won downstate, no surprise. What about the rest of the state? All that money.
But he got 54% of the vote statewide out of 30% of people that showed up.
With an enormous war chest. I mean, you would think that the margins would be larger there.
So, Bridget, you followed the corruption scandals in Albany pretty closely.
And I think we have an opportunity here to talk. We spent a lot of time talking or listening to people talk about the effect of the Moreland Commission during the governor's race. Janice, obviously, it would be interesting to hear your perspective on that commission and sort of the kind of specter of the federal investigation force lawmakers in the legislature to take up ethics reform? Do you think that there's
No.
and talk more, was that doomed from the start?
Oh, was the commission doomed from the start? I don't think so. The people who worked on the commission staff were extremely talented, probably the most talented group of people I ever worked with. From our chief of investigations, Danya Perry, who had come from the U.S. Attorney's Office, and a number of the other special counsels and junior attorneys. We really had an impressive team, and we were doing a lot of work. And the Moreland Commission statute allows for all kinds of really interesting opportunity to look into how the structure of government works, because you don't need to be motivated by any, subpoenas don't need to demonstrate any kind of criminal wrongdoing, and indeed our goal was never actually to uncover criminal wrongdoing. Most of the stuff that we found that was on the border of criminal was purely just because some legislators and people in government were so sloppy that they violated these ridiculously lax rules. But we were just really trying to learn about how legal corruption works, right? I mean, the flow of money in state politics through these enormously broad channels, which are completely legal. Obviously, the legislature was opposed to it from the start, and eventually the governor came around to their point of view. But I think, so there's kind of two questions you're asking. So were we doomed? I think had we been allowed to continue, we could have put out a lot of useful information about the way government works that would have been helpful to people, perhaps beyond this table. I mean, I think a lot of what we uncovered wouldn't have been that shocking to political insiders, but the New York State government operates in a world where Most of the players are okay with living in an insular world that most of the state doesn't understand. It's what allows things to happen in the shadows, and I think that was our goal, to bring things out of the shadows. The odds of any ethics campaign finance reform having is zero, I think. I mean, Governor Cuomo claimed victory on it. That was as much as Sheldon Silver wanted to offer and Dean Skelos wanted to offer. I don't see any way or reason there would be any reform in that area until there's a new governor.
Me, just, I'm
Sorry,
I guess I'm a little more optimistic in a sort of pessimistic way. It depends what the U.S. Attorney's Office does now. If they, again, I have no inside information. They've taken the Moreland Commission records. They're following up on how the governor's office sort of astonishingly mishandled the whole thing. If there's more that comes out of that investigation, it may create impetus for action in Albany. Absent that, I assume it'll be the same, the usual sort of kabuki theater that we usually see around these kinds of things.
But if the U.S. Attorney does indict several lawmakers, how do you see that actually happening?
Well, again,
I mean, the same lawmakers that are in the same.
No, because it creates public pressure that something has to happen. And the muscle memory in Albany is to advance a new ethics package riddled with loopholes that really doesn't do much.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
There was a Public Corruption Act passed, right? And neither you nor I were satisfied with it, but it allowed them to hold a press conference.
No,
right?
and now, whether or not they get away with it is going to be the issue. But I think only that happens if what you just described happens. We don't know what's going to come out of the U.S. Attorney's Office. It may just be a critical report. It may not be anything, right? They may not do anything, and we don't know. But if they do something and some lawmakers get into trouble, or members of the executive branch get into trouble, or there's a very critical report that comes out of the U.S. Attorney's Office, that creates an environment in which it is possible for something good to happen. And I'm an optimist. I work for NYPIRG. Absent that, it is, I think, extremely difficult to imagine that anything would happen.
But you see this happen in other states. I mean, in Ohio in the 80s, there was a U.S. attorney who came down really hard on lawmakers in Ohio, and then all of these indictments happened, and then in the 90s, they just went back to business. The legislature changed, the rules changed, et cetera, the loopholes grew, and the same thing's happening in New York right now. The past 7 years, we've had 34 scandals. In the past 20 years, how many lawmakers have you seen get indicted, get out of office? But before that, it wasn't happening in New York. So, it begs for a bigger question. How do we make an institutional change versus these short-term fixes?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and I think to that point, I guess from the point of view of the average voter, that it's working. It's all working because they are seeing elected officials, many of them are elected officials, getting arrested, going to jail. And remember, we had, 3 governors in 4 years or something of the sort? So from 2009, I mean, there are, voters are saying we wanted a grown-up in Albany. And however you may describe Andrew Cuomo's first term, to a lot of voters, it seems relatively stable. And he was able to accomplish a lot of things legislatively. And they are seeing people get arrested and get hauled off. So, yeah, I think from the point of view of the average voter that this was working.
People who get arrested are people who are often outside the power loop, right? Yeah. If you are a backbencher assemblyman from a poor district, then maybe you see the upside to trying to rig a contract for $10,000 in kickbacks. If you are in the power source, you are not going to do that. You are going to use the very generous campaign loophole structure that Blair was talking about to raise enormous amounts of money legally. You're going to have well-placed staffers at consulting firms and lobbying firms, and
or you're going to have a law practice on the side where, huge interests need to hire.
Though there is John Sampson, though.
Yes.
And Smith.
There is Sampson and Smith.
Right, sure, yeah. I mean, but that goes back to my previous comment about how they came, I think they were elected and kind of raised in this permanent minority status, and where, there was no real expectation.
No risk.
But yeah, so I think that the people who are being hauled off in handcuffs are not the people running New York State.
Right, okay, so you talked about, I'll get you one sec, Jeff. You talked about the data, you didn't talk about this, but I read about the data analytics work that Moreland was doing, which is kind of fascinating. One of the things he said was that quoting someone long ago who I can't remember, the scandal isn't what's illegal, it's what's legal, right? And you guys were using data analytics to trace how money was actually impacting votes and policy outcomes. Can you talk a little bit about that and whether that information will ever see the light of day?
I'm not sure I can talk about that. Being on these panels is always a little awkward for me. But I will say that, look, the analytic work that is coming out of places like MIT is very transferable to politics, especially when you have easy data sets to work with. For example, Tom DiNapoli puts every state contract in a very downloadable Excel spreadsheet. Anybody can do it. And take a look at cross-referencing that with campaign contributions, J-COPE data. This is all stuff that really anybody could do with time, and people like Bill Mahoney were real masters, Excel whizzes and that kind of stuff. So I do think that what MIT is developing is really a more basically turning what Bill Mahoney does into something that you can do with Google simplicity, right? Being able to just run searches on the flow of money in politics and how that affects, say, contracts, how it affects. Votes is a little trickier, right? Because the way, as all the people who have been kind of Albany wizards know, votes don't really say much, right? Things come to a vote when Dean Skelos and Sheldon Silver think they're ready to, with rare exceptions. So, but yeah, I think those kind of analytics will be soon broadly available to media outlets, to good government groups, and I think it'll make it a lot easier to trace the flow of money in politics.
And on a national scale, the Sunlight Foundation creates all these apps regularly for everyday users because, these are available, but usually it's journalists and lawyers who are utilizing them or consultants. But everyday people don't know where this information is available, and they're always asking, how do you track where the money's coming from? How do you track your lawmakers' votes? And, MIT's doing great work, but it's not available to the public quite yet.
Jeff Clout, jump in.
I just a little bit point of departure that the idea that it's all hell in a handbasket and that's voters' view, and that the issue that they care most about is campaign finance, which I think there's a very colorable argument about the importance of campaign finance, but I think there's a clear thing from a voter's perspective. It's not what they care most about. Most voters worry about their own lives, not campaign finance. And I think from outwardly signals in New York, the budgets are on time, the credit rating has improved, taxes are down, and it's being run relatively well if you look relative to any other state in the country. So if it's all hell in a handbasket, I think it's one thing, but I think it's a misperception to think that these issues that we've surfaced here around wrongdoing, public corruption are somehow coloring voters' life, and it seems a hell of a lot better right now than it was, 4 or 5 years ago.
But 70% of the public didn't show up at the polls, right? So now that could be that they're really happy. They're so happy that they didn't go vote.
Why is the assumption that voters who didn't show up would vote different than voters who did show up?
I'm not saying that whether or not who they voted for, it's whether or not they show up at all. And that, to
they didn't
me,
show up
seems...
it was down all over America.
Yeah, but 30% is the lowest, historic low in New York State. Ever.
Well, and they elected 3 statewide Democrats and Republicans in the state Senate. So
I don't care who they vote for. I care whether or not people show up to vote. And I think my hypothesis is that the reason that 70% of New Yorkers chose not to vote is because they're unhappy.
Well, my hypothesis is when there's competitive statewide elections, that drives voter turnout, and they're not driven by local races.
There's plenty
and
of
largely we didn't have
That's
competitive.
because those big candidates are messaging to them.
We didn't have competitive statewide elections. We had a governor who won by double digits. We had a controller without a race, and we had attorney general.
In 1986, we had the same thing when Mario Cuomo ran for re-election, and they had higher turnout.
There's actual evidence. If you look at the Senate races, the people who cast blank ballots cast them in disproportionately in elections where there was no opponent. In other words, people are saying, and people who did write-ins disproportionately where there was no opponent. Now, there aren't massive numbers of write-ins, but what they're essentially telling you is, I'm not going to vote if there's no opponent. I'm not going to vote if there's no opponent. And interestingly, in New York City, where lower numbers of people, as I pointed out, are voting, fewer people are casting blank ballots because the people who come to vote are willing to vote the ticket even if there's no opponent. But there are less people coming to vote. So there are two distinct phenomena going on. A couple of points. I hate to introduce academic stuff at a university, but there's literature on political culture, and states have different political cultures. I learned this when I went to Minnesota, and I discovered that it was different than New York. Imagine that. And so we're much more tolerant of advancing yourself personally in politics. You know, and in fact, our proportion of population that is we're a haven for, and blessed to be a haven for immigrant populations. So personal advancement is very attractive through politics, is attractive to immigrant populations. So our demographic dynamic is reinforcing a certain cultural characteristic. So now the excess of that is corruption, you know. But we should not assume that we're Wisconsin or Minnesota. We have a different culture, and that has some consequence. One other point that's bothered me a lot, and when we condemn, I'm not a big fan of corruption. You know, having said that, you know, when we condemn corruption without comparison, it bothers me. In other words, are we worse than Kentucky? Are we worse than New Jersey? Are we worse than Illinois? I used to say, God bless Illinois, you know, for their indicted and convicted governors.
Some people might add Louisiana.
You know, so let's have some perspective as we look at the question.
One of my friends who's an elected official in Arkansas, their state motto, of course, is "Thank God for Mississippi," so that they're 49th and everything. But why don't we close by doing a quick lightning round here? I'll ask you a few questions and just go around, and even the academics on the panel will be limited to 10-second answers. So, first question. Oh, I didn't mean you in particular. So, first question. What's the number one issue with the most heat and light around it in Albany next session, and does legislation around it pass? Basil.
The one issue? My guess is I think rent regulation.
And?
I don't think the mayor gets all that he wants.
Okay, Jeff.
I think they'll go back and do a women's agenda of some sort.
Successfully?
Yes, but I'm not sure what'll be in it.
Okay.
I'll agree with rent regulation, and I don't think the mayor's going to get all he wants.
Cuomo was a master of claiming victory, so the women's equality thing will result in the same 9 points being passed, and he'll claim victory.
It'll be the budget, and it'll pass.
That's a good answer.
It is the answer, I think.
Maybe I'm an idealist, but the DREAM Act, I think it's...
I would say rent regulation, the history on it, though, is that it continues to get watered down. It wouldn't surprise me if that's the case this time. Sleeper issue is going to be, I think, the Tappan Zee Bridge funding and the toll impact that it's going to have in the suburbs.
I think we're going to have a massive fight on education aid combined with capping the property tax revenue and reducing revenues from property taxes for all local governments outside across the state.
Most contentious, I think, will be rent regulations.
You know, if the Republicans were smart and looked long-term to what happened to their gubernatorial candidate, they would pass the DREAM Act. And that's a political analysis. The on-time budget is the most important thing to the governor. The other issues, there are 15 of them that come up.
So we'll do it again, but we'll go in the other direction. And we're going to actually, unless you want to add anything, Tom's answer sort of sets up that question is what should the Republicans be trying to do to hold on to the majority that they have now? What would be the achievement that would, help them solidify?
The Republicans need to grow their base.
So DREAM Act.
Yeah, I mean, that they need to find issues that are contrary to the way they are viewed nationally.
Jake.
Yeah, I agree with Tom. DREAM Act. I mean, abortion's somewhat of a sticky issue because some people just don't believe in that, but that would help.
Professor?
I think they need to keep the governor on a fiscally centrist, right-center path so they could claim continued influence on the economic development and economic conditions in New York.
I would say to sort of broaden it, I guess I would stick with the DREAM Act. And ironically, it's it's former Governor Pataki who passed the law that allows the children of undocumented immigrants to get in-state tuition. And I don't quite understand, they're in this sort of kooky position now that doesn't make any sense to me. So they voted for in-state tuition. Why can't you get financial aid?
For Republicans to maintain parts of, for Republicans to win over a new base in downstate and upstate, Western New York, the DREAM Act, and for them to maintain their base in upstate economic development. I mean, look at what Buffalo got. Buffalo billion, Syracuse now wants their billion, Rochester wants their billion. Everybody wants their billion.
Yeah. Ben? Well, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that everyone should be focused on improving the, in many cases, dismal state of schools around the state.
Giannis?
Go for the libertarians and young voters with some major drug law reform, decriminalization of marijuana.
Thomas alluded to the sort of boom and bust cycle of midterms versus presidential years, and I think that Republicans are very much in danger of 2016 looking like 2012. If I were them, there might be a small political price to pay, but I would look at doing mid-decade redistricting and try to shore up their most vulnerable members.
It's constitutionally blocked in New York,
It's constitutionally blocked.
in the state
So
constitution.
you get another chance.
All right.
That is one.
Wow, you got me there, Professor.
An exception to the
That's
norm.
my job.
That is one devious political mind. That's a Daily Kos guy suggesting it. Wow. Jeff?
If I were the Republican leader, I would do something on higher education affordability, with all due respect to the institution we're sitting in and the fine institutions represented by some around the table, but the cost of higher education at the community college level, at the four-year college level in America, New York, is absurd. And parents feel squeezed by it. And I think the model is going to explode so that at some point, Harvard will still exist, but a lot of Americans will be doing all this online because there's no way the cost structure is sustainable.
Yeah, my son's 3. I've already told him he goes to the new school or nowhere.
I wholeheartedly agree with that, but I'd add my own. I would say the DREAM Act, I think it's the right thing to do. It grows the party, and New York has always been at the forefront of movements going back to the Niagara movement. There's no reason we can't do this.
Final question, one-word answer. Do the Republicans have effective control of the New York Senate in January 2017?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes, but I don't know.
What kind of lobbyist are you? Yes.
No, but I don't know.
Define effective control.
Like, I mean, in addition to whatever IDC people they can peel off?
Yes.
Absolutely not.
You threw in the IDC. Without the IDC.
I said, I used the word effective control.
They have control themselves.
All righty. Well, thank you, Bridget, for coming here and co-moderating with me. Thank you to all the panelists.